Hello everybody, welcome to the Wonky Angle, where I talk about electronic music, both new and old, and today I'm talking about album number 12 from Squarepusher, Ufabulum. Right, so I think I've made it clear in the last couple of Squarepusher videos that I never thought mixing and mastering to be among the guy's strong suits, and it really came to a head on his previous albums, Just a Souvenir and Showbleader 1's The Demonstrator, where the bad mixing became distracting and almost inexcusable. While I still generally enjoyed it, his stuff was really starting to polarize his fans, and he'd need to step up his game in order to get people back. Enter Ufabulum. This album is kind of like his equivalent to Orbital's Wonky, a return to the sounds of old while combining them with some sounds that were more popular at the time. Even came out within a month of each other, fancy that. Now, I don't think the more modernized sound was everyone's cup of tea. It's not like this is also one of those albums that basically everyone agrees is really good or anything. No, this was... still definitely had its detractors, but for me personally, this is definitely a return to form for the dude, and his best album since Hello Everything. And the main element that contributes to that is that he finally addressed the criticism I started out this video mentioning. That is to say, the mixing and mastering on this album is maybe the best he's ever done, right up there with Ultra Visitor. Is it a better album than Ultra Visitor overall? Probably not. I still like the jazzier elements of his sound more, and Ufabulum doesn't involve even the slightest lick of that. It's 100% electronic, and I think that might have led to a first impression of the album thinking it was one of his least impactful. I don't remember liking it much initially, but returning to it now, I turned out to basically love the whole thing. Despite the more modernized sound, I think this is a very solid album with top-notch sound design, and there's more substance here than any of your typical modern dubstep releases. The guy set up a really futuristic and epic sound with his thing that I really enjoyed and haven't really heard anything like from his other albums. For people worried about the modern dubstep elements in this thing, there's no just like straightforward, like Scary Monsters and Nice Sprites style dubstep on here. There's no Beelzebub or anything like that. There's some occasional bass wobbling, but for the most part, it's kinda going back to the drum and bass intensity of some of his earlier stuff like Go Plastic, albeit with more melodic elements involved. It's still very much Squarepusher, just with modern polish and a futuristic makeover. So let's talk individual tracks on this thing. The album's basically split into two halves. The first half of this album is more melodic and almost poppy in some ways. Lots of bright, shiny, polished, spacey melodies. If some people think these melodies help make the album more generic sounding and like they're playing to a stadium crowd or something, I'll understand. There's even a track here called Stadium Ice, so it's not like there's no truth to that at all, but I think it really helps cement this super dramatic and epic futuristic sound that he's going for, and really helps me get immersed in the sound of this album. 4001 starts the album off showing what you ought to expect out of this thing, starting out percussive and intense, but bringing in these huge sounding synth sequences. And the bright melodies also show up on Stadium Ice and Energy Wizard. Almost spirit-lifting stuff here, especially in the case of the former. Stadium Ice is really happy sounding and unambiguously so, and Energy Wizard is more on the dramatic and percussive side. There's also Red and Blue, which is just kind of a purely ambient interlude, just some subtle synth melodies, and provides kind of a moment to breathe in this thing. Sounds almost like a Boards of Canada track from the future or something. The one maybe weak point on the first half of this album might be Unreal Square, which is a track that I can't decide is great or terrible. See, the thing is that the main melody of this track is played on this super sharp and shrill 8-bit sound. It sticks out like a sore thumb, and if I'm not in the right mood, that synth setting is really annoying. But by the same token, it's also easily the catchiest track in the whole bunch, so it does have that too. And it's also one of the more interesting tracks on here, probably the closest the album comes to straight modern dubstep, but it never gets quite there. Like the drop is kinda carried by some fast-paced breakbeats. And the sound design is so dense and frantic that it never feels like we've dipped completely into generic territory. But anyway, now that we've touched on the first half of this album, let's talk about the second half, where things take a turn for the dark and atonal. The metallurgist is no less intense than previous moments, but all the melodies replaced by, like, weird, spooky noises. This track is probably the closest we get to something along the Go Plastic lines. Just pure balls-to-the-wall noisy intensity. And maybe as a result, it's not a huge highlight for me personally, but it's still a nice track that I don't skip. Personally, if I want this kind of metallic noisy density, I prefer the next track, Drax 2, which structures itself in a much more complex and interesting way, and even provides this dark and brooding atmosphere to complement it. Or the lead single from this thing, Dark Steering, which on one hand, feels kinda weird to think that this track was a single by itself. But whatever, it's one of the best tracks on this thing. Dark and dramatic melodies, abrasive acid synths, lots of weird glitchy effects, especially in the back half, and I really like that part about 3 minutes into the track where he starts to get the synths to start imitating a car engine revving. Makes the steering part of the title make more sense. Now, if the acid synths were to your liking on that track, then perhaps unsurprisingly you'll particularly like the next one, 303 Scope 'em Hard. Just kinda picking up right where Dark Steering left off, even has some of the engine revving synths, I think. And there's even some acoustic drums accompanying this one. I think it's a bit on the repetitive side, but dang, those TB303 acid synths are great. And finally, the album ends with Ecstatic Shock, which kinda bookends 4001. Very similar track there, being pretty percussive, but bringing back those awesome synth melodies again. Not quite as in your face as on the opener, but still providing an effective closer to this album. But before we discuss final thoughts, we gotta talk about bonus tracks, and there's a fair bit to discuss. First of all, there's of course a Japanese exclusive bonus track, because of course there is. And you know how The Demonstrator hid one of its best tracks in the Japanese version with On Fire Again? No? Yeah, I didn't mention that in the review proper because I forgot to check if it had one. But yeah, sometimes it's absolutely worth the effort to seek out these exclusive tracks. Like in that case, you got the most intense and adrenaline-pumping track in that whole collection. In the case of Ufabulum, though, it is absolutely not worth the trouble. The track On Crack is by far the worst Japanese exclusive bonus track I've heard on a Squarepusher album. Just a very simplistic beat with little to no detail in it or much engaging at all. Kinda like sticking Future Gibbon at the end of Feed Me Weird Things, but worse. I've heard some people talking about how this is his way of making fun of the typical business decision to have these Japanese versions have bonus tracks, and him basically saying he was getting sick of the whole practice. Which again is pretty weird to me because that didn't stop him from putting good stuff in the bonus tracks before, but whatever. On Crack is not worth the trouble and is like a joke at best. That said, there is a deluxe version of this album that also includes the 3-track EP Enstrobia as a bonus. On Spotify you can check them out separately, and I actually highly recommend you do because that EP is actually pretty damn good. And makes for quite the effective companion to this album, maybe even enhances the entire experience. My favorite of the 3 tracks has to be the first one, Angel Integer, which seems to take some cues from like 80s pop or something in its melodies, though still being made up of the same ingredients as the first half of the main album. The main melody even seems to be played on this flute-like sound, giving it this kind of sparkly, dreamy sound, and being paired up with this other squonky lead synth that doesn't undercut it, but helps give it some more experimental flavor. The other 2 tracks on here are also pretty dang good as well. Panic Massive brings back the distorted fuzzed out guitar from the last 2 albums, but it's mixed so much lower than the other elements, so that it's just an additional texture added into the bright and shiny structure. Kinda copy-pasted from the previous track, in a way. And it's even got some actual bass playing, too. Pretty funky little licks thrown in here and there. Finally, it ends with 40.96A, which is just pure experimental atonal ambient noise, improvised live. If this were the ending of the actual album, it'd be unsettling as hell and it wouldn't match the rest of the album all that well, but Pacing-wise, it would work really well, and maybe even a little better than Ecstatic Shock, which, ends a little abruptly comparatively. Regardless, the Instrobia EP is very good and worth your time. Probably the most I've been impressed by bonus content on a Squarepusher album that I hadn't heard yet. So let's finish off this review how I feel on Ufabulum overall. Personally, I think this is in the upper tier of Squarepusher's work. I recall this not being all that impactful initially, but I can't entirely remember what it was about it that made it not resonate with me at first. I mean, obviously, it resonates with me a lot stronger now, so whatever. Between the very much improved mixing and mastering job that makes the sound of this album feel so much larger in scale than the usual from the guy, and the incorporation of more contemporary electronic elements presented in a creative and unconventional way, and just the epic and futuristic vibe that I don't get out of any other Squarepusher album, I've really taken a liking to Ufabulum now. I still think stuff like Ultra Visitor was better, since I like the jazzier elements, or Hello Everything was better just because the melodies and ideas behind that album stuck with me more, but I don't know. I just know that I think this is a really solid Squarepusher album that shows the guy can still deliver really strong material even this late into his career, and I would definitely say it's worth checking out. I'm overall feeling an 8.3 out of 10. But of course, this is just my opinion, you can feel free to disagree with it, but I'd like to hear your thoughts, so leave comments in the comment thing down there. But yeah, that's pretty much it. That's all for today, see you next time.